In the years after World War II, Americans' day-to-day habits changed due to new innovations and technologies.
This is the tragedy that changed the course of history immensely. People survived eating all sorts of weird and health hazard things during World War I. Let's explore the 25 weirdest foods people ate. Number 25. Sawdust bread. World War I ushered in with itself a new age of famine and destruction, the likes of which the world had never seen before.
Here's one I mixed up fresh this morning. No pre-ferment, no aging in the refrigerator overnight.
Industry gave humans the power to wreak havoc on fellow humans and nature alike. Times like these forced people to supplement their diet with things that would leave us nauseous. This proved to be life-saving for these people, though, as their supply lines were cut and resources dwindled under constant bombardment and siege. Flour commonly used to make bread was in short supply in regions close to the action because people could not smuggle flour inside besieged cities, nor could they grow anything at all given the heavy artillery bombardment of their fields, which led to the complete destruction of them. A solution to this problem, therefore, was using sawdust instead of flour to make bread, a practice that proved harmful to the extent of causing permanent stomach problems for those that used such bread for the rest of their lives. Number 24. Trench stew cooked with rats. World War I is famous for its trench warfare. Trenches were dug for miles on end to give cover to soldiers and enhance defense capabilities. Soldiers were forced to spend months at times in those trenches in all sorts of horrific conditions, facing deadly diseases, food shortages, and terrible climate.
As you see, it's just enough to cover. The reason for this is there's just enough potatoes and vegetables.
All of these factors created a very suitable environment for scavengers, like rats, to multiply and infest those trenches. Imagine waking up to see a rat chewing on your ear. Such a sight was sadly not uncommon in both Allied and German trenches in World War I. Food shortages meant that the soldiers were forced to scavenge for anything edible they could find within the trench and boil them in a stew to feed themselves, just so they could avoid starving, and this meant using the rats themselves. Other ingredients in the regular trench stew would be any herb or roots growing within the trench, moldy bread, and even horse meat at times. Number 23. Horse meat. Horses were always essential for the war effort in human history until that changed in World War I. 1 million horses and mules were transported to France to take part in cavalry charges and other duties involving transport and artillery. The general soon realized their inefficacy in battle, when the frightened animals would refuse to charge and prove to be ineffective against machine gun fire. This led to them being sent to the back of the line, where they would spend months starving in terrible conditions. Horse meat has always been one of those if you got nothing else kind of rations.
The best part about sitting at the counter is while enjoying our appetizers, we can watch the sashimi being prepared.
A well-supplied army almost never ate it, but a starving army was thankful for the meat. And so, the French army in times of desperation would resort to slaughtering these unfortunate beasts in order to satiate their own hunger. Using horses for their meat was not just limited to the army, though, as even Russian and British farmers in times of extreme famine and distress would resort to slaughtering their own farm horses to feed their families just to survive. Number 22. Tree bark. Hunger is a terrible enemy and can make people go mad. Hence, when famine struck the civilian population in World War I, people went to all extremes to combat this enemy, and this even included resorting to eating the bark off of trees. Reflecting the desperation of the starving people, tree bark was often grounded and mixed with whatever flour they were left with to bake bread. This fibrous and difficult to digest bread was then served to provide how many calories, you may ask? 0. And the cellulose within the bark meant it induced constipation that would cause whoever ingested it to spend countless hours in the toilet regretting their decision to consume it. Regardless of the lack of the calories and the discomfort it caused, this weird but desperate invention was yet one of the many food people had to eat in order to ensure their survival in one of the most turbulent times in history. Number 21. Potato peels. A common practice amongst the poor who couldn't afford food in World War I was stealing potato peels off of streets. Back in those days, potato peels were left on the street 3 times a week so the peel farmer could come collect them with his horse and carriage and sell them to pig farmers. These potato peels were often stolen by poor people before he would arrive. Now, you must be wondering what possible reason they would have to steal them, right? Those potato peels would be turned into a number of makeshift delicacies that were strange yet essential to the survival of the poorer families. These dishes range from potato chips made from the peel to soups. As the war progressed and supplies ran out, even the influential and middle class were forced to survive on these rations in Germany to provide whatever nutrition it had. Number 20. Dogs and cats. Dogs are regarded as man's best friend, but in times of desperation, even pets are not off the menu, as was seen during World War I. Besieged cities would have their food supply lines cut off, and as supplies dwindled, people had to scavenge for whatever scraps of food they could find to survive. For some families, food was sitting right outside in their backyard. As starvation set in, people had to decide whether to starve or eat their pets, and they usually chose the latter option, as weird and sad as it may sound to pet owners. Those without any pets would go out on hunts at night to kill stray dogs and cats to provide sustenance to their families. People say entire cities would be wiped out of stray cats and dogs within weeks of coming under siege. Imagine going out on a walk and coming across a bunch of people running after a stray with knives. Now that's a sight we'd never want to see. Number 19. Earthstats coffee. Coffee has always been the brew that jump-started everyone in the morning for the day ahead. But when coffee shortages arose in Germany as a consequence of the naval blockade of German ports, German citizens were greeted with a new kind of horror. Coffee substitutes, or Earthstats coffee, as it was called, were pushed into the market to replace real coffee. Earthstats coffee was made up of ground acorns and roasted chicory, and tasted just as horrible as its ingredients do. And yes, people still bought and drank it purely out of habit. With many comparing the taste to literal mud, Earthstat coffee haunted the people of Germany until the end of war, and people abandoned it just as quickly as they had adopted it. The era of Earthstats coffee shows us that even shortages and famines cannot stop people from missing out on starting their day with a good old cup of joe. Number 18. Pigeons. It's common knowledge that the trenches in World War I were some of the most inhospitable and cruel places in the war. The way these trenches were constructed meant that logistically, it would take weeks for supplies to arrive on the front lines. This meant frequent food shortages for the unfortunate soldiers serving on these lines. One of the most unconventional food sources for these soldiers were carrier pigeons. Soldiers were always on the lookout for a lost carrier pigeon in the sky, which they would then shoot down and cook for their own consumption. Picture this. You're a British officer who just sent a pigeon to your headquarters with a very important message, only later to see your enemies feasting on it.
Don't complicate it. So this is some of the wood pigeon that I got. And the breast, I've left little bits of skin and fat on there.
Practices like these are the reflection of the horror of warfare and starvation, and the effect they have on human beings who must battle through the odds to survive. Number 17. Hardtack. Dog biscuits and molar breakers are amongst many names given to hardtack, an essential component of the ration pack given to every British and Australian soldier in World War I. But as important as they were on their diet, these unpalatable biscuits were hated just as much due to their hardness and bland nature. A cheap and proven technology, hardtack has ruined the breakfasts of many soldiers, yet has persisted for decades as the go-to food and a supplement to perishable food that cannot be carried for weeks and months without going bad. And when they were not using them as food, the soldiers would often use hardtacks in lighting fires, and surprisingly, even writing letters on them to send back as souvenirs. Even though hardtack may still haunt the dreams of veterans, it has sustained many soldiers through months of food shortages. Number 16. Insects. In times of scarcity, anything and everything went when it came to food. That is why the next item on our list may sound like the stuff of horror if imagined as food. Insects, common to the trenches, were often hunted and collected by the soldiers. Now we know what you might be thinking. Insects as food? Never in a million years! But when survival matters, even insects can look appetizing. As a part of a regular diet in many cultures around the world, insects are rich in protein and require little to no requirements in cooking. Just a couple of minutes over a flame, and you have yourself an exquisite roasted grasshopper or a cricket ready for your next meal. The consumption of insects by soldiers proves that looks can sometimes be deceiving because the nutritious bugs had enough protein in them to provide soldiers with the right amount of energy to survive the hardest of times in the trenches. Number 15. Wacky Cakes. Wacky Cakes won't drive you crazy as the name implies, nor does it have any strange ingredients. In fact, it doesn't have any of the ingredients that you would normally find in cakes, which are butter, eggs, and milk. Referred to as depression cakes by people, Wacky Cakes had been around in different eras of hardship, from the Great Depression to both of the World Wars. These cakes are made from oil substitutes for butter and plain water substituted for milk. This spongy cocoa-based cake has managed to stick around even now and has become every vegan's choice due to its simple nature and plain ingredients. Still, back in World War I, people were forced to substitute normal cakes and desserts in place of Wacky Cakes, given the absence of flour and eggs in times of scarcity. Wacky Cakes may have been given bad PR given their bland nature, but whenever hard times rolled around the corner, these cakes were always there to provide comfort and joy to families going through those hardships. Number 14. Turnips. The winter of 1916, or Turnip Winter, as it was known amongst the Germans, was a period of profound civilian hardship during World War I. Fertilizer shortages and bad weather led to one of the harshest winters faced by the general populace. Potato crops had failed, and in turn, German soldiers increasingly relied, for sheer survival, on one of the least appealing vegetables known to man, the humble turnip. Turnips were usually used as feed for the cattle, given their bitter taste and lack of nutrients, but as famine set in, it was replacing almost everything in the German diet.
I'm going to use black pepper and some red pepper flakes. Some people do add sugar to offset the mild bitterness of.
Imagine relying on one of the least appealing vegetables for your daily meals. Turnips became a staple in the German diet, being used in stews, baked with bread, and even included in soldiers' rations. It's incredible how the scarcity of food during the turnip winter affected not only the general populace, but also reached the front lines of the war. Number 13. Nettles. Have you ever gone on a walk through the wild countryside and find yourself itchy and rashy later? I bet you all know what pesky plant is to blame for that. Nettles. Can you imagine finding those annoying greens in your soup? Well, believe it or not, during wartime rationing, civilian populations had to get creative with their food sources. Nettles, known for their strong taste and fiber qualities, were foraged by people and used in soups and sauces. Rich in vitamins and other essential nutrients that were otherwise missing from the common diet, Nettles actually provided much-needed sustenance to many families during those difficult years. Nettles were soon found in everyone's victory gardens to combat famine and food shortages.
These are the seeds we're after. These contain the wealth of nutrition and medicinal properties.
So if you're ever inspired to try this soup for yourself, just remember to wear gloves the next time you go out foraging, unless you want a nasty surprise. Number 12. Fish head soup. Yum! Up next, we're going to introduce you to a fascinating wartime recipe that was born out of necessity. Fish head soup. War rationing meant that you had to make sure you were not wasting any food, and that meant using everything you had at your disposal. We all love fish, but the thought of ever making a soup out of the head or the tail has surely never crossed our minds. Meanwhile, people in World War I had been instructed not to waste even those parts while cooking, and so came into popularity the fish head soup. Discarded pieces of fish would be boiled in a stew with vegetables that people grew in their gardens to create a broth that, despite consisting of waste, was rich in both taste and nutrition. And that's not all you were getting out of it. The stock, when cooled down, would be converted into a gelatin-like jelly, which could be preserved and boiled down later to be used again. Number 11. Hobo Stew. Mulligan stew, better known as Hobo Stew, was a staple to those stuck in the economic hardships that came from the Great Depression, but its roots can be traced back to World War I, when food shortages and rationing caused people to look towards alternatives as food sources. Anything and everything goes into making a hobo stew, and when we say anything, we mean it, folks.
And I'm gonna let it simmer about 15 to 20 minutes to get all the flavors incorporated in there really well. You'll get some more juice out of that tomato that way by letting it cook that long.
Resembling the trench stew, which was native to the trenches and the front lines, the hobo stew was restricted to the homeless folk and families hit hard financially by the raging war. From bits of moldy bread discarded by a restaurant to weeds growing in gardens, this stew was unlike anything you'd ever seen. It has even been said that homeless people in California would put cigarette butts in their hobo stew to add to the aroma. Now that's overkill if you ask us. Number 10. 1916 Gingerbread Sponge. During World War I, people ate this meal in various ways, depending on the country and what ingredients they had. This special cake was popular because it was sweet and comforting during tough times. Let's take a look at how different countries enjoyed this treat. In England, people loved to make it for tea time. They used ingredients like flour, ginger, sugar, and molasses. Since food was rationed, they often used less butter and eggs than usual. People would bake the cake, let it cool, and then enjoy it with a cup of tea. Sometimes they would add a bit of jam on top or even spread some butter to make it tastier. In France, it was a bit different.
Just make a few slices.
The French called it pain d'épices, which means spice bread. They added spices like cinnamon and cloves, making the cake smell amazing. French families would bake the cake and serve it as a dessert after meals. They also enjoyed it with a hot drink, like coffee or hot chocolate. During the war, they had to be creative with ingredients, sometimes using honey instead of sugar. In Germany, gingerbread was already a traditional treat, especially around Christmas. During the war, people still tried to make it, even though they had to use substitutes for some ingredients. They might have used beet sugar instead of regular sugar and added more spices to give it a strong flavor. Germans would often enjoy the cake with coffee or milk, and it was a special treat for children. In the United States, it was also a favorite. American families used recipes passed down from their ancestors. They added spices like nutmeg and allspice to their cakes. During the war, they had to deal with food shortages too, so they sometimes used applesauce or mashed potatoes to keep the cake moist. Americans loved to eat it at family gatherings and holidays. In Canada, it was similar to the American version. Canadian families enjoyed baking and sharing this cake, especially during the cold winter months.
A full cup softened to room temperature, and to that I'll add a full cup of that packed dark brown sugar.
They'd use local ingredients like maple syrup to sweeten the cake. Canadians would often eat it with whipped cream or a drizzle of syrup on top. Even though World War I was a difficult time, it brought a bit of joy to people. Families from different countries shared similar recipes and made this delicious cake with whatever they had. It was a small comfort that reminded them of home and happier times. Eating it during the war showed how food can bring people together, even in the toughest situations. Number 9. Fatless Carrot Cake. During World War I, many people had to change how they cooked and ate because there wasn't enough food. One special recipe that became popular was the fatless carrot cake. This cake didn't use butter, oil, or other fats, which were hard to get at the time. In England, the government encouraged people to grow their own food in gardens. Carrots were easy to grow and became a key ingredient in many recipes. British cooks found that carrots could be used to sweeten cakes, and so they made this meal. These cakes were moist and sweet, even without butter or oil. In Germany, food shortages were also a big problem. People had to be creative with what they had. German bakers made carrot cakes without fat because they didn't have much butter or oil. The carrots helped make the cake taste good and stay moist. In the United States, people are also dealing with food rationing.
Okay, so I've made my icing now, and all I have left to do is to pop it on the cake. The cake's been out of the oven now for about an hour, so it's completely cooled.
They used carrots in their baking to replace some of the ingredients they couldn't get. American housewives found that fatless carrot cake was a good way to make a sweet treat without using up their limited supplies of butter and sugar. So, during World War I, people in different countries found ways to make delicious cakes using simple ingredients like carrots. These cakes helped them enjoy a sweet treat even when times were tough and food was hard to come by. Number 8. Yorkshire Parking. During World War I, people in Yorkshire made a special treat called Yorkshire Parking, a type of gingerbread. Because food was scarce, they had to be creative with what they had. Parking is made with simple ingredients like oatmeal, flour, butter, treacle, which is a thick, dark syrup, and ginger. First, they mixed the dry ingredients, oatmeal, flour, and ginger. Then they melted the butter and treacle together. Sometimes they used lard instead of butter because it was cheaper and easier to find. They mixed everything together to make a sticky dough. Baking the parkin was a bit tricky because not everyone had an oven at home. Some people used their fireplaces or took the dough to a local bakery to be baked. Once it was baked, they let it cool and sit for a few days. This made the parkin moist and sticky, which everyone loved. Eating parkin was a special treat. People would cut it into squares and enjoy it with a cup of tea. It was especially nice during cold weather because the ginger made it warm and comforting. Even though times were tough, Yorkshire Parking brought a little bit of sweetness and joy to people's lives during the war. Number 7. Oatmeal Cookies. During World War I, people made oatmeal cookies with simple, easy-to-find ingredients because food was often scarce. Soldiers needed food that could last long trips, so these cookies were perfect. Here's how people prepared and ate oatmeal cookies during that time. First, they gathered the ingredients. Since butter, sugar, and eggs were hard to come by, they used alternatives like lard or margarine, and sometimes even honey or molasses instead of sugar. They used rolled oats, which were cheap and filling. Sometimes they added dried fruits like raisins or nuts if they had any. To make the cookies, they mixed the oats with the fat, sweetener, and a little flour. If they had eggs, they added those too. Then, they shaped the dough into small balls and flattened them on a cookie sheet. They didn't always have fancy tools, so they used whatever they had, like spoons or even their hands. Baking was done in wood or coal ovens, and they had to be careful not to burn the cookies. Once baked, the cookies were cooled and stored in tins or jars to keep them fresh for as long as possible. Soldiers carried these cookies with them because they didn't spoil quickly and gave them energy. Families at home enjoyed them too. As a treat during tough times, sharing these homemade cookies brought a sense of comfort and normalcy amidst the hardships of the war. Number 6. Ginger snaps. During World War I, soldiers and people at home liked to eat ginger snaps, which are small, crispy cookies with a spicy, sweet taste from ginger.
Either one works great.
These cookies were popular because they could last a long time without going bad, which was very important during the war when fresh food was hard to get. In America, ginger snaps were made with molasses and spices. Families baked them at home and sometimes sent them to soldiers as a treat. Soldiers enjoyed them because they were a sweet reminder of home. In Britain, people also loved ginger snaps. They were sold in small tins and were a common snack for soldiers. British families would often enjoy them with a cup of tea. Ginger snaps were a comfort during tough times and helped people feel a bit more normal. In Germany, ginger snaps were called Lebkuchen. They were a bit softer and sometimes had a chocolate coating. These cookies were a festive treat, especially around Christmas. Even during the war, people tried to keep some holiday traditions, and Lebkuchen was part of that. In France, ginger snaps were not as common, but similar cookies called pain d'epis were popular. These were more like gingerbread and often enjoyed with honey. They were a special treat that people savored during the difficult war years. Overall, ginger snaps and similar cookies brought a bit of sweetness and comfort to people during World War I. Whether they were sent to soldiers or enjoyed at home, these cookies were a small but important part of life during the war. Number 5. Corned beef rissoles. These were a popular meal because they were easy to make and used simple ingredients. Corned beef was a common item in rations since it could be canned and stored for a long time. To make rissoles, people mixed the corned beef with mashed potatoes, onions, and sometimes breadcrumbs. They shaped this mix into small flat patties and then fried them until they were crispy on the outside.
Alright, so we have all 4 of our patties down in the pan, and I'll let those cook for like 6 minutes on one side.
Soldiers enjoyed corned beef rissoles because they were a tasty break from plain canned meat. Civilians also made them at home, using what little they had during the tough times of the war. Rissoles were filling and comforting, helping to make difficult days a bit more bearable. Even though the ingredients were simple, this meal brought a bit of warmth and satisfaction to those who ate it. Number 4. Pathfinder Pudding. Pathfinder pudding was one of these unusual foods. It was made from simple things like flour, water, and dried fruits. These ingredients didn't spoil quickly and were easy to find. The pudding didn't taste amazing, but it filled people up and gave them energy. People ate Pathfinder pudding and other odd foods because they had no choice. They were doing their best to stay strong during tough times. Number 3. Lentil Soup. Lentil soup is a warm, cheap meal made from lentils, which are small, round legumes. During World War I, people ate a lot of lentil soup because it was cheap, nutritious, and filling. Soldiers in the trenches needed food that would give them energy and keep them full for a long time, and lentil soup was perfect for that.
Now, be careful if you're using a store-bought chicken broth.
Back home, food was often rationed, meaning there wasn't always a lot to go around. Lentils were a good choice because they could be stored for a long time and didn't spoil quickly. People would cook lentils with whatever vegetables and spices they had, making a simple but tasty soup. This made lentil soup a common and important part of meals during the war. Number 2. Mock turtle soup. Mock turtle soup is a dish made to taste like green turtle soup, but without using real turtles. Instead, people use calf's head or other meats, adding spices and vegetables to mimic the turtle flavor. During World War I, real turtle soup was hard to find and too expensive. Soldiers and civilians turned to mock turtle soup as a tasty and affordable alternative. They enjoyed it for its hearty, comforting qualities, especially during tough times. It was a popular choice because it used easy-to-find ingredients and could be made in large batches to feed many people. Number 1. K-Brat. K-Brat or Krieg-Brat was a type of bread eaten during World War I. It was made because there wasn't enough wheat to make normal bread. Instead, people used a mix of different grains like barley, rye, and even potato flour. This bread was darker and coarser than regular bread.
It's crust, nice and crispy.
Soldiers and civilians both ate K-Brat because food was scarce. It didn't taste as good as normal bread, but it was filling and provided energy. People often ate it with soup or spread a little bit of butter or jam on it if they had any. K-Brat was an important part of keeping people fed during tough times. These were the 25 weirdest foods people ate during World War I. Comment below if you think we missed something. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.